Britain, after the war, needed locomotives fast, but didn't have the copper or the cash for American-style diesel electrics. So, a bold plan: cram 4 screaming V12 engines and 2 superchargers into one machine, all battling for control over a single labyrinthine gearbox. On paper, it promised to outperform steam with raw mechanical brawn. In reality, it was a rolling migraine, louder than a squadron of Spitfires, and so fragile that a single loose bolt could tear it to shreds. 6 engines feeding one impossible gearbox made it a mechanical nightmare. Why did anyone think that machine could ever succeed? The answer starts here, with a nation in crisis and a blueprint nobody dared to question. In 1947, the Ministry of Supply handed out copper like it was gold dust. Locomotive works got barely enough for signals, let alone for miles of heavy generator windings. British Railways, just nationalized, stared down a balance sheet that bled red ink. Every ton of copper cost more than a fireman's yearly wage. The London Metal Exchange listed copper at £210 a ton, if you could even get it. Imports limped in from Africa and Canada, but half of it vanished overseas as part of Britain's post-war debts. Parliament rationed what was left. Railways were lucky to see 5% of the national quota, just enough to keep the lights on, not to build a fleet of American-style diesels. A single diesel-electric locomotive needed 20 to 30 tons of copper for its generator and traction motors. Multiply that by 100, and you're talking about swallowing a third of the country's annual copper supply. The Board of Trade did the math and winced. Every ton added thousands of pounds to the cost of a locomotive. Mechanical transmission, by contrast, barely sipped copper, less than a ton per machine, most of it in control wiring. The rest was steel, oil, and sweat. Weight was just as tight a constraint. British bridges, some older than the Queen, could not handle the axle load of a big American diesel. Civil engineers capped new locomotives at 21.5 tons per axle. Anything heavier risked closing half the network or spending millions on upgrades nobody could afford. Steam engines got away with it because their weight was spread over more wheels. Diesel electrics, with their heavy motors, tipped the scales in all the wrong places. The mechanical drive, lighter by design, fit under the ceiling barely. On paper, it made sense. In the depot, it was a different story. Every decision came down to what the bean counters and the bridge inspectors allowed. You could hear the frustration in the canteen. They want us to build a miracle, but they won't pay for the parts. That's how you end up with a locomotive that is all engines and no margin, a machine born from scarcity, built to the limits of what post-war Britain could scrape together. Mechanical transmission was not just a clever workaround, it became a policy obsession. The technical committees at British Railways pored over axle load calculations like priests reading tea leaves. The target was 116 tons in total for a mainline diesel. Anything heavier, and the bridges would groan, the accountants would faint, and the whole modernization push would stall before it started. Every memo from the boardroom hammered the same point: keep it light, keep it simple, keep it cheap. But the only way to meet those weight limits, with the copper rationed and the bridges set in stone, was to drive the wheels directly. No heavy generators, no electric motors, just gears and shafts and oil. One draft memo dated March 1949 spelled it out in dry bureaucratic language. Mechanical transmission is to be preferred where axle loading and material scarcity present operational constraint. That is how the direct drive concept wormed its way into the official doctrine. The civil engineers wanted numbers, the bean counters wanted savings. The mechanical boys promised both, as long as someone else figured out the details. The technical brief for the new locomotive demanded a maximum axle load of 21.5 tons, spread over enough wheels to keep the bridges happy. On paper, a mechanical system could hit that target, while a diesel-electric system would tip the scales by several tons, mostly copper and the bulk of those traction motors. The committees loved the idea of weight savings. They loved it so much they were willing to overlook the mess it would make in the maintenance shed. The thinking was simple. If you could build a gearbox big enough, strong enough, and clever enough to blend the power of 4 engines into one drive shaft, you would solve the weight and copper problems in one go. Gearbox was the promise. The risk was that you would be betting the future of British railways on a machine that had never existed outside a drawing board. But when every alternative meant blowing the budget or rebuilding half the network, the unconventional path started to look inevitable. That is the world Colonel Fell walked into. A world primed for radical ideas as long as they came with a promise to keep the bridges standing and the accountants from reaching for the smelling salts. Leonard Fell did not look like a man who would build a monster. He was an RAF colonel, sharp-eyed, with a mind tuned for the chaos of airfields and the split-second decisions of wartime engines. In the world of trains, he was an outsider, an aero engineer who saw railway problems through the lens of redundancy and risk. If one engine quits at 10,000 feet, you do not wait for a miracle. You design for failure. That is how you live to fight another day. So when the railway men grumbled about not having a single big diesel, Fell shrugged and reached for his notebook. Why not 4 smaller ones? 4 engines, each ready to pick up the slack if another faltered. It was the same logic that kept bombers in the sky when flak shredded a cylinder bank. But this was not a bomber. It was a 50-foot-long box on steel wheels, and it would have to fit under British bridges and on rails built for Victorian weights. The heart of the beast was the Paxman 512. Each one was a 500-horsepower lump of cast iron and crankshafts, with a bore of 7 inches and a stroke just shy of 8 inches. 4 of them sat in the frame, 2 at each end, arranged like teams of rowers in a racing shell. If they pulled in perfect time, the train surged ahead. If one missed a beat, the whole rhythm threatened to come apart. Fell did not stop at 4. To squeeze every bit of power from those V12 engines, he added 2 auxiliary engines, AEC diesels, each driving a roots blower to force air into the main engines. 6 engines in all, each with its own job, each with its own oil leaks and quirks. The auxiliaries spun up first, hissing and whining as they built pressure for the main event. The main engines followed, each one a symphony of pistons and valves, ready to be called into action by the man at the throttle. This was no ordinary locomotive. It was a rolling experiment in controlled chaos, designed by a man who believed that complexity could be tamed if you respected its rules. The challenge was never just about horsepower. It was about making all those moving parts march to the same drumbeat and hoping none of them tripped over their own feet. Fluid couplings were the secret handshake between the engines and the gearbox, a way to keep all that power from tearing itself apart. Picture 2 fans facing each other inside a sealed drum. One is hooked to the engine, spinning faster and faster. The other is connected to the wheels, waiting for the rush. There is no physical link, just a bath of thick oil. As the first fan whips the oil, the second starts to turn, pulled along by the swirling fluid. That is how torque gets from engine to wheels, without the metal-on-metal violence that would shred a clutch in seconds. But the real magic came from the scoop tube. This was not a fixed bucket of oil, it was adjustable on the fly. At low speeds, the scoop pulled most of the oil out of the working chamber, letting the engine spin up gently while the wheels lagged behind. The slip between the 2 fans was huge, sometimes 20%. You would hear a rising howl as the fluid churned, softening the jolt that would otherwise snap a shaft or strip a gear. As the train picked up speed, the scoop tube slid back, letting more oil flood in. With the chamber nearly full, the 2 fans locked together, and the slip dropped to just 1 or 2%. That meant almost all the engine's power hit the rails, with barely any wasted as heat or noise, at least in theory. This slip was the difference between a smooth start and a pile of broken parts. Too little oil, and you would never get moving. Too much, too soon, and you would feel the whole machine lurch and groan. The engineers tuned the fill level so that, at speed, only a thin margin of slip, just enough to keep things safe, remained. Most days, that meant a loss of about 1 to 4% of the engine's effort, traded for the right not to rebuild the gearbox every week. With 4 engines, each with its own fluid coupling, the system could blend power like a bartender mixing drinks. One engine could be brought in gently, then another, each one slipping into the flow without sending shockwaves down the drive shaft. The scoop tubes let the driver feather the engagement, keeping the whole works from shaking itself to bits. It was delicate, almost elegant, until the gears had to take over. That is when the real trouble started. The Fels gearbox was a feat of stubborn engineering. 3 differentials were stacked and locked into the next, all trying to tame the chaos of 4 main engines. Each engine sent its power through a fluid coupling, then into a set of gears that did not just blend torque, they refereed it. 2 engines at the front, 2 at the back, all converging in a central box so dense it looked more like a safe than a transmission. The first differential paired the engines on each end, then a secondary differential took those 2 streams and forced them together. If every engine hit the same beat, the result was a perfect surge. If one lagged, the gears clashed and the whole assembly shook with the violence of a mechanical argument. But the gearbox was only half the story. Feeding the main V12 engines took more than just fuel, it took air, and lots of it. That is where the 2 auxiliary AEC diesels, each pushing 150 horsepower, came in. Their only job was to spin the massive roots blowers that force-fed air into the main engines. Without those blowers, the V12 engines would choke at low speeds, starved of the oxygen and torque they needed to move the train. The count climbed to 4 big engines to drive and 2 smaller ones to feed them. 6 engines, 1 gearbox, a web of shafts and belts running the length of the frame. The auxiliaries always fired up first, their high-pitched whine echoing through the steel before the main engines even stirred. The power path ran like a relay. Auxiliary engines spun the blowers, blowers fed the mains spun the fluid couplings, couplings fed the differentials, and the differentials tried to keep the peace. Everything funneled down to a single output shaft, sending all that effort to the wheels. The torque loads were staggering. Every shaft, every bearing, every bolt had to survive the combined fury of 6 engines. Paxman gear designers called it a nightmare. Mechanics joked you needed a physics degree just to change the oil. Every time the gearbox was opened, there was a sense of dread. Would today be the day a tooth was missing or a bearing run dry? The constant threat was that one bad shift could tear it all apart. The morning ritual started with a sound no other locomotive could match, a high-pitched whine from deep inside the frame. That was the auxiliaries, 2 AEC diesels, each barely the size of a car engine, but spinning up like their lives depended on it. Their whole job was to drive the roots blowers, forcing air into the 4 main Paxman Phi 12 engines. No boost, no power. You would wait for the green light on the manifold gauge, and only then touch the starter for Engine 1. Engine 1 was always first. Turn the key and the V12 coughed to life, 12 pistons hammering in their bores. The cab trembled. A glance at the gauges, oil pressure, manifold air, coolant temperature, everything had to be just right. If the auxiliary engines were not feeding enough air, the main would not even catch. If oil pressure dropped, you shut it down and reached for the toolbox. Nobody wanted to be the one who spun a bearing before the train even moved. With Engine 1 idling, the next step was pure choreography. The scoop lever, just a simple rod on the control panel, was the only thing standing between a smooth engagement and a gearbox full of shrapnel. Pull it back gently, and the scoop tube inside the fluid coupling started to fill the chamber with oil. At first, only a trickle. The impeller spun, flinging oil at the turbine, but the slip was huge, maybe 20%. The wheels crept forward, almost floating. Too much oil, too fast, and the whole drivetrain would lurch, sending a shudder through every bearing and bolt. Too little, and you would sit there, engine howling, train refusing to budge. Once the train reached walking speed, 6 miles per hour give or take, you would feel the moment when the slip dropped. The scoop tube slid further, letting more oil in, and the torque hit the rails. That was the cue for Engine 2. Another V12, another set of gauges, another round of prayers. Bring it in too early, and the engines would fight each other, sending pulses down the shaft that could crack a differential gear. Wait too long and you would lose momentum, the whole mass of the train threatening to stall. The two engines had to match revs within a hair, or the gearbox would protest with a scream you felt in your teeth. Every step demanded precision. The driver's hands danced between throttle and scoop, eyes flicking from tachometer to oil pressure to the vibration in the floorboards. Miss a cue, and you could feel the machine's anger, a shudder, a groan, maybe a spike on the oil temperature gauge. The auxiliaries kept humming, their job far from over. As long as the main engines needed air, those little diesels spun at full tilt, feeding the beast. The whole process was a balancing act, every lever and dial a reminder that this was no ordinary train. It was a rolling experiment, and you were part of the control group. By the time both engines were engaged and the train was rolling steady at 6 miles per hour, you had earned a brief moment of relief. But the real challenge was just beginning. 2 more engines waited in the wings, and the gearbox had yet to show its true colors. For now, every bearing held, every gauge stayed green, and the monster moved, barely tamed, never truly under control. At 17 miles per hour, the third V12 joined the fight. The driver eased the scoop lever and watched the tachometers dance as engine 3 spun up. The cab's floorboards began to buzz, a low-frequency tremor that crept up your legs and settled in your bones. Each new engine did not just add power, it doubled the racket and tripled the risk. 4 rowers in a boat, the old hands used to say. If they pulled together, you flew. If one caught a crab, the oars tangled and the whole crew ended up in the drink. Inside the gearbox, the differentials strained to keep order. 3 engines now, each with its own heartbeat, each feeding torque through a maze of gears. The vibration monitor, a simple dial bolted to the bulkhead, started to twitch. At this speed, the slip in the fluid couplings dropped to a bare minimum. The howl of oil churning between impeller and turbine gave way to a harsher metallic resonance. The cab grew hotter, the air thick with the smell of diesel and scorched lubricant. The driver wiped sweat from his brow, eyes flicking between the rev counters and the oil pressure gauge. Miss a rev match by more than a few revolutions per minute, and the whole gearbox would lurch. The crew braced themselves, boots planted wide, hands gripping whatever they could find. The auxiliary engines screamed in the background, feeding the blowers that kept the main V12 engines from choking. 6 engines, all howling in their own register. The sound was less like a train and more like an air raid, layer upon layer of mechanical fury, each one threatening to break free. At 24 miles per hour, the 4th and final engine locked in. The tachometer needles lined up, 4 red marks quivering just below the danger zone. The gearbox, now forced to channel the full 2,000 horsepower, shuddered under the strain. The vibration peaked. Paxman's own test notes recorded oscillations strong enough to rattle the bolts loose on the cab panels. The floor vibrated so violently that standing still became a test of will. Crewmen sometimes stuffed rags under their boots to keep their feet from going numb. The noise reached a level that defied description. Even with ear defenders, conversation was impossible. Every surface in the cab became a sounding board, amplifying the clatter of pistons, the whine of gears, the scream of the blowers. The air shimmered with heat, the smell of hot oil mixed with a tang of ozone from sparking relay contacts. Every sense was under assault. But for a brief moment, with all 4 engines rowing in perfect time, the train surged forward like nothing else on rails. The tractive effort at 12 miles an hour hit 25,000 pounds, the kind of force that could drag a coal train out of a flooded pit. The whole machine felt alive, straining at its limits, daring anyone aboard to trust it for just 1 more mile. Yet everyone in the cab knew the truth. The gearbox was the weak link, the villain in this story. With every surge, every vibration, every spike on the dial, you could feel the monster testing its own chains. It was a symphony of noise and power, beautiful, terrifying, and always on the edge of flying apart. The cab was already shaking like a jackhammer when it happened. 4 engines at full song, the gearbox screaming under 2,000 horsepower, and every bolt in the transmission straining to hold the monster together. Then, without warning, a bolt deep inside the gearbox let go. Maybe it was a hairline crack, maybe metal fatigue from 1,000 hours of vibration. Whatever the cause, the result was instant. 1 second, the gears were meshing at hundreds of revolutions per minute. The next, a chunk of steel sheared clean off and shot straight into the teeth of the main cog. The sound was like a cannon shot, metal on metal, a deafening crunch that drowned out even the engines. In the space of a heartbeat, the perfectly timed dance of pistons and gears turned into chaos. The main differential jammed solid. The shockwave tore through the gearbox and the casing shattered as if it were glass. Oil erupted from the breach, spraying across the cab and painting everything in a slick black film. The floor lurched, hurling tools and lunchboxes against the bulkheads. For a moment, nobody could tell if the machine was still moving or if the whole train had jumped the rails. Inside the gearbox, the gears did not just stop, they tried to keep turning and ground themselves into shrapnel. The failed bolt, now wedged between two spinning gears, acted like a wedge in a log splitter. Teeth snapped off, bearings collapsed, and the entire assembly seized in a matter of seconds. The vibration that had started as a warning hum now rattled every bone in the crew's bodies. The driver's hands went numb on the throttle. Someone shouted, but nobody could hear a thing over the roar and the splatter of oil hitting hot metal. When it finally went quiet, the only sound was oil dripping onto the floor and the hiss of cooling metal. The monster was dead in its tracks. One bolt, just a few inches of steel, had brought down 4 engines, 1,000 moving parts, and the hopes of every engineer who ever thought they could outsmart physics with gears and oil. Getting the Fell back to Derby Works was not just a matter of hooking up another locomotive and dragging it home. First, the line had to be cleared. Oil covered the ballast beneath the train, and the rails themselves were slick from the spray. A breakdown gang arrived with sand, shovels, and a lot of bad language. They spent hours cleaning up the mess, just so a rescue engine could get close enough to couple on. The Fell, dead weight at 116 tons, had to be towed at a crawl, no brakes, no power, just a massive, silent hulk rolling back through the Peak District. Every mile meant another risk. The seized gearbox threatened to lock the wheels, and any sudden jolt could have twisted the already damaged frame. The tow took the better part of a day, inching from the hills near Manchester back toward Derby. Traffic backed up behind it. Timetables fell apart. Crews along the line shook their heads as the black box limped past, streaked with oil and shame. At Derby Works, the real work began. The locomotive was shunted into a siding, and the teardown started. Mechanics faced a gearbox that had split itself open. Oil had seeped into every crevice, mixing with metal shards and shattered bearings. The main casing, once a fortress of steel, was now cracked and warped. Gears that should have lasted a decade were chewed down to stubs. The failed bolt, or what was left of it, was fished out from between 2 broken teeth, blackened and bent. Repair invoices stacked up. The first estimate for the gearbox rebuild came in at £1,200, more than the annual wage of a skilled fitter. Parts had to be machined from scratch. Nothing like this existed on the shelf. The locomotive sat idle for weeks, then months, as Derby's best tried to piece the monster back together. Every day it lingered in the yard was another reminder of what overcomplication cost. The maintenance crew's morale took a hit that did not heal quickly. Word spread through the workshops: if the Fell rolled in, you would better hope your name was not on the roster. The job was thankless, greasy, and endless. And everyone knew, deep down, that the next time a bolt let go, it could all happen again. September 1958. The Fell sat silent in a siding at Derby Works, its paint streaked and its name already fading from the roster. The last blow did not come from the gearbox or the engines. It came from the steam heating boiler tucked behind the cab, a squat metal drum meant to keep passengers warm on winter runs. That morning, something went wrong. Maybe a pressure valve stuck, maybe a fuel line leaked, maybe it was just the kind of bad luck that haunted this machine from the start. The boiler flashed over. Flames licked up the wood paneling, feeding on decades-old varnish and grease. Within minutes, the rear of the locomotive was an oven. The fire brigade arrived fast, but not fast enough. By the time the hoses soaked the last embers, the superstructure was gutted. The cab roof sagged, glass melted into puddles on the floor, and the paint blistered off in sheets. Charred wiring hung from the ceiling like black spaghetti. The gearbox, for all its stubborn strength, was buried under a layer of soot and ash. Photos taken after the fire show a carcass, windows blown out, steel warped, the whole rear end twisted by heat. You could still see the outlines of the engines, but the heart of the machine was gone. The fire did not just end its career, it erased any hope of resurrection. Nobody at Derby Works even considered a rebuild. The order came down within days: cut it up, sell the scrap, and move on. The loudest nightmare on British rails ended not with a roar, but with a hiss and a plume of greasy smoke. The fire had barely finished smoldering when the paperwork started. British rail management did not waste time on sentiment. Within a week, a memo from Derby Works landed on the desk of the chief mechanical engineer, laying out the costs in black and white. Rebuilding the fell meant more than patching up scorched paint and melted wires. The gearbox alone would need another full teardown, new gears, new bearings, and a fresh set of bolts custom-made at eye-watering prices. The engines, already past their prime, needed a full strip-down to check for heat damage. Even the auxiliary blowers and control wiring would have to be replaced. The first estimate topped £3,000, and that did not count the lost weeks in the shop or the labor hours Derby could never bill to a paying customer. Across the hall, the finance office ran their own numbers. By September 1958, a brand new diesel-electric could be ordered for less than £30,000, delivered with a warranty and a service contract. The copper shortage was easing, and the latest traction motors weighed half what they did a decade before. Every pound spent on the fell was a pound not spent modernizing the fleet. The budget memos spelled it out: the experiment had run its course. The Class 100 and 100 was unique. No spare parts, no production line, no hope of economies of scale. Even if the fire had not happened, the next breakdown was only ever a shift away. The official authorization to scrap came down on September the 22nd, 1958. A single line in the asset register read, "Withdrawn, to be dismantled." No ceremony, no second chances. For the men in the depot, it was a relief. The monster that had haunted the workshops was finally headed for the torch. The lesson was as clear as the balance sheet. Sometimes the only way forward is to cut your losses and move on. Today, railways chase silence and reliability. Complexity is the enemy, not ambition. The fell's legacy lives on as a warning. Elegant engineering often means fewer moving parts, not more. As artificial intelligence and automation drive us toward denser webs of code and machinery, the real risk is not failure, it is forgetting that simplicity is survival. Every innovation writes its own warning label. Thanks for riding through this piece of mechanical madness. Let me know what you would trust on your next journey.